Hello there, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, the show that goes there. Yeah, Stacy.
Hey, Max. By the way, it's just a week and a half from today that we will be imposing tariffs, big tariffs on European goods. This was a bit of a shock in the past. It came out of the blue. We were in these trade wars, Cold Wars, Civil Wars. We had all these wars flying back and forth, and lo and behold, suddenly we start sanctioning, imposing tariffs on European goods. And this is based on a WTO ruling that they decided that, in fact, Airbus had provided $7.5 billion worth of subsidies to Airbus from the European Union nations. So we get to impose some. And of course, Trump picks out all the nice foods. If he doesn't apply, he famously likes things like hot dogs and hamburgers and Burger King stuff and McDonald's and junk food. So he's applied it to things like, Stilton cheese and Gouda and stuff like that.
Not brie, I hope.
I don't think so.
Yeah, well, this is what happens when you take the gold standard away from the world economy. The way that nations try to recreate a gold standard is by imposing tariffs on each other to even things out. And it creates an enormous bureaucracy, and it creates an enormous need for banks to print up money and contracts, and it creates a need for lawyers, and it creates a need for all kinds of administrators, which is great for them. But it's a drain on the economy because that money could go into actually productive parts of the real economy, supporting real jobs with real wages and real GDP growth. But we are post-gold standard, of course, by many decades now. And so the need to create layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy and tariffs now, new tariffs, is what happens when you take away the gold standard. Eventually, we will go back to the gold standard, as we've been saying. That will come back as soon as this thing collapses, which is now a dead certainty.
Well, speaking of dead certainties, of course, the Airbus doesn't drop out of the sky as frequently as the Boeing airplane. So now, unless we want to pay the 10 or 20, between 10 and 25% of the various tariffs being applied, but I believe it's 10% on Airbus products. So there's that. But also, it's interesting that you mentioned the printing of money, and why is the fact that, say, for example, the ECB has printed more money than the Federal Reserve? Why is that not considered a subsidy as well? Are we going to start getting down to that sort of micro level of who's printing and cheating more? They're all cheating, essentially, is what they're saying. But some are cheating faster and harder than others.
Right. It's a form of cheating. Again, when you leave the gold standard, there's no way to have an accounting or a balance sheet that shows exactly who's trading with who and what it's worth. So you print money to cheat, to undermine, to try to grab a few extra pennies or euros here and there. And that is part of the scheme, and that is what happens when you have fiat money and central banks and fiat and fractional reserve banking, and it just ends up into this huge, enormous pyramid of paper that throughout history, for the past 300 years, every single instance of paper money has collapsed to zero without exception.
Now, there's another thing regarding this printing of money for the various populations in order to avoid acknowledgement of the fact that you no longer have a real economy because of the gold standard, mostly. Now, one of the things that we've always talked about is the Cantillon effect, because when they're printing money, it goes to a certain class of people first, those closest to the central bank, and then that goes basically to the big banks, the big multinational banks, and they primarily lend to housing speculators, right? So anybody who's already on the property ladder when all of this thing began, they benefited from asset price inflation. So I want to look at this headline, and this is a chart that PlanetPonzi, Mitch Feierstein, tweeted. It's the number of years a skilled service worker needs to work to be able to buy a 60-meter squared or 650 square feet flat near the city center. And I want to look at, in particular, the top 3 of these cities, because in these top 3 cities, since 2009, this little dark circle on the left for Hong Kong, Paris, and London is where it cost, how many years it took to afford a average 65-meter square property in the city center. In Hong Kong, it was 10 years. In Paris, it was about 12 years. London, it was maybe 8 or 9 years back in 2009. Now look at the jump since then. Hong Kong is now over 20 years. It was 10 years before, now it's over 20 years it takes to afford just an average property in the city center. Paris, it's about 15 years now, and London has jumped to just under 15 years. So when you think of, especially Hong Kong and Paris, you think of all the protests going on, the very, very, very similar. They both look exactly alike. You have police shooting out people's eyes, and you have all sorts of people, not just young, but like a whole range of classes. Those who are outside, who do not own already a 65-meter squared or 60-meter square property in the city center versus the rest.
Right, and it's no coincidence that those are three of the most widely trafficked and most often used finance hubs in the world. These are the three of the biggest finance hubs in the world. So in those areas, the Cantillon effect, as you call it, the ability to keep standing on top of the money pile you're printing.
Yes.
And so you are building your own paper mountain, and you're standing on top of that mountain, and everything you're standing on are fine art, that you're buying for $100 million a crack, or a chateau in Switzerland, or a new Lamborghini. So you're standing on this mountain of paper money that you've just printed for yourself. And the people downriver, who are now in the valley of poverty, they're throwing rocks, but you're getting higher up the paper mountain, so the rocks don't reach. So then they have to get more agitated, and they get more organized. And now you've got social unrest, as you have during moments in history when the underclass decides that they've had enough.
And Munich is the top of the German cities that is overvalued, or at least has jumped the most. Germans are famously don't like to go too much into debt. It used to be in 2009, it was 5 years, and now it's close to 10 years. And I think Frankfurt is pretty high as well. There are also very few assets that people could buy. So this is the one last investment in our global economy. It's all basically, as we pointed out before, the assignat. Our entire economies are backed by the value of homes. It's always worked out, as you see in Hong Kong and Paris, the same way. Like, it always ends up like this. So
right, the assignat being the French version of the Cantillon effect, and monetizing property, in this case church property, to flood the economy with bad credit, bad money.
In a pyramid scheme.
In a pyramid scheme. So we're in the new pyramid scheme, of the 21st century pyramid scheme. And the people that are getting abused by this pyramid scheme are starting to get extremely agitated. There's Ray Dalio, runs Bridgewater in Connecticut, biggest hedge fund in the world. He keeps pointing out now for a couple of years that he's looking for the pitchforks and the torches, the mobs in the street, to come after the people like Ray Dalio. He's warning folks.
Yeah, you should go read his LinkedIn page, and he posts some interesting blogs. The guy's worth like over $10 billion, and he's just, he's a successful investor. And what he says is like, I just look at history. I'm just looking at this objectively and neutral. I'm not taking a side. I'm just telling you that this is very similar, a period of time right now between the 1920s and 45, essentially. The late 1920s and 1945 is people get angry, and we split into fascists and communists, and that's what's happening now. And this is part of it. This tweet here I have from Ben Rickert, and it shows that the velocity of money is the frequency at which one unit of currency is used to purchase domestically produced goods and services within a given period of time. In other words, it is the number of times $1 is spent to buy goods and services per unit of time, all-time low. The rise in the circulation, the velocity of money, people spending more money, commerce happening, exchange happening, the trickle-down effect happening was in the 90s up to 2000, and then it's been down ever since, and it continues to hit all-time low. Money is not circulating. It's being hoarded in these properties. It's being hoarded by guys like Ray Dalio, who, as he points out himself, I'm not just like accusing him, he says he can't spend more than this. He's already got so many chateaus and yachts that he can't buy anymore. He would forget about them. You lose, yacht, you forget you have a house in, in Mustique or something.
Yeah, the economy is being choked out.
Yeah.
So here's a unit of currency. This is a dollar.
Yes.
This is the dollar you're speaking of.
Yes.
So velocity of money means that the Treasury would print a dollar, and you'd buy a donut, And then the person, the donut shop that gets your dollar goes and buys a hammer. And then that hammer at the hardware store, that guy goes and buys another donut, right? So it's circulating.
Yes.
It's velocity.
It's a healthy economy.
It's moving through. But what has happened since the bailouts of 2008 is that the central banks keep printing more money. They print trillions of these things. But it gets stuck at the primary dealers and at Jamie Dimon's JP Morgan. Because so it gets choked out. They don't lend it out. They don't circulate it. They keep it. They hoard it.
Yeah, but they keep giving it to people that are unable to spend it. So, as we know, the ordinary American is literally paycheck to
paycheck. They don't lend it out to small and medium enterprises.
No.
They only lend it out to property speculators.
Yes.
And people are buying expensive artwork.
Yes.
Or they put it back onto the balance sheet of the Fed for an interest rate. Right? So again, it's just the circle is extremely tight. It's not a wide circle of the entire economy. It's a little minuscule micro circle like the tip of your pinky where the money is circulating only amongst 3 or 4 people, and they keep getting wealthier and wealthier. And that's why we, as Ray Dalio points out, we're at the tipping point of huge revolutionary social unrest.
Yeah, because also, of course, what happens is all this stuff, all of our economic problems are caused by these economists at these central banks, this false thinking that somehow they are superior and understand the world better than all these schmucks out here in the world, in the real world. So that is part of one issue that central bankers and bankers have, is that if that money does circulate down and ordinary people, the bottom 99%, start raising their living standards, they freak out. Like, that is the scariest thing to them, and they think that it's going to be like, oh my God, this is going to cause inflation, and so they seem to prefer mass deflation, as we have.
Well, they hate gold because they don't want anyone to have proper savings, because they would have economic sovereignty.
They don't want the lie exposed as well.
They don't want their Ponzi scheme and pyramid scheme destroyed. That's what gold does to paper money Ponzi schemes.
And finally, speaking of paper dollars, that used to be backed by gold. Well, U.S. congressmen ask Fed to consider developing national digital currency. 2 U.S. lawmakers want the Federal Reserve to consider creating a digital dollar. In a letter sent to the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell, Representative French Hill, Republican of Arkansas, and Representative Bill Foster outlined concerns that they have risks to the U.S. dollar if another country or private company creates a widely used cryptocurrency, and ask whether the central bank is looking into creating its own version. We are concerned that the primacy of the U.S. dollar could be in long-term jeopardy from wide adoption of digital currencies. Internationally, the Bank for International Settlements conducted a study that found that over 40 countries around the world have currently developed or are looking into developing a digital currency.
Right, I saw that story. And it plays into what we've been talking about here, because if all these nations create digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, it would increase the velocity of money. And it would give countries a way to move away from the dollar. And the dollar is feeding the very specific Ponzi scheme. So because it is digital gold, and it would increase velocity, and there's very, very little friction between these digital currencies amongst countries. The velocity of money would skyrocket, wages would go up, and you would see the kleptocracy class would be challenged.
I would quickly in this last few seconds here say that only Bitcoin is digital gold. This is essentially an altcoin, and this will put all those altcoins out of business, because there's no reason to hold Libra. There's no reason to hold EOS or ETH or any of the other
That's be another impact, is that the current crop of altcoins would become extinct.
Yes, and it's good for Bitcoin, though.
It's great for Bitcoin. Oh, we're going to take a break. When we come back, much more coming your way. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Mitch Feierstein of PlanetPonzi.com. Mitch, welcome back.
Hey, Max. Great to be here.
All right, first, Mitch, remind the audience what exactly you do, or what you did, or what you do when you were a Wall Street banker. Briefly, what is your area of expertise, Mitch?
My expertise since the 1980s was in the creation and development of new products, derivative products, always the state-of-the-art products, Max, as we've discussed in the past. So looking for opportunities where there are no other competitors and less crowded fields. I think that there are too many people in a crowded space, like all the people that are jumping in on the FANG stocks We've just had momentum over the past couple of years.
All right, so you're a contrarian. You're early into all kinds of different things. You've been embedded in the Wall Street heart for many years, and as someone deep in the heart of global finance, what do you think when you see events that happened in the repo market over the past few weeks, Mitch?
Well, I'm looking for value. So, when I see something wrong in the repo market, the repurchase agreement market, it reminds me of what happened with Drysdale Securities back in the 1980s, when we had a real problem, a disconnect in the repo market. So there's something very wrong. And if you ask the experts and you speak with them on Wall Street, they'll tell you that it's strictly technical. But I don't know that it is strictly technical. I think that there are a lot of the big money center banks that are too big. I mean, look, Deutsche Bank, which we've discussed many times, their balance sheet with all the rotten derivatives that they have on it, with trillions and trillions of dollars in derivative products. JP Morgan, too big to fail, too big to bail, too big to exist. All of these banks have never been broken up. The Fed has entered into the markets. Every central bank on the planet has added hundreds of trillions of dollars in liquidity, and that means guarantees for certain different asset classes. The central banks have caused the problem, Max. This product is just one of the ancillary issues that we might be seeing now. When you create so much liquidity and have a universe of $17 trillion in negative yielding bonds, this is the kind of problem you get. You get unintended consequences.
All right, so Mitch, when the Fed steps in with hundreds of billions of dollars, as they did with this repo maneuver just recently, is this the beginning of quantitative easing? Is it the same as quantitative easing? Is it different than quantitative easing? It looks and smells like quantitative easing on the short end anyway. How does it differ?
Well, it is. It's a permanent open market operation. So they're going to be adding liquidity, and eventually they're going to come in, and whether they want to call it QE4, QE5, we've discussed this before. It's QE infinitive. They will have to do QE again, and they'll have to do it before the end of the year, because this repo issue is not going to go away. There's a shortage of liquidity in that market, and the Fed has to come in and do something. The only thing they can do is keep adding liquidity to the market every day. So the open market operations that they have will become permanent, and it will probably go back into bond buying. Goldman has recommended that they come in and buy $20 billion a month. So this is QE. I don't care what they call it. It's QE infinity. They've entered into a place right now where we will see eventually negative interest rates in America. I said this 2 years ago. I stick by it. I think that we're in a whole load of pain to come. I think what we should have done back during the credit crisis is never bailed these guys out. Bankruptcy is a normal market mechanism that allows insolvent institutions and insolvent corporations to go bust. We have back in January, I highlighted the WeWork Ponzi scheme on Twitter at PlanetPonzi. I said they're trying to sell this for $47 billion. They lose enormous amounts of money. It is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. But because there are so low interest rates and negative interest rates, you've got children pouring money into illiquid investments to get some kind of yield. So when you have that happen, eventually it's going to hit the fan and it's going to end really badly. And I think we're at the point now where a lot of these unicorns are taken out behind the shed and they're being slaughtered en masse. People who have invested, look, there's a reason why high yield should be trading above 10%. High yield is trading where investment grade used to trade. It's ridiculous. The world is disconnected from reality, man.
All right, covering a lot of ground there. Let's just review some of the thoughts that you have. So you are saying that quantitative easing 4 or QE4 is baked into the cake. We're going to see that very soon. You're also saying that negative interest rates are coming to the United States. What that means is that, at least in Europe, what we've seen is that people get a negative interest rate on their savings account, ultimately at the bank, which is the same thing as confiscation. I don't know how else you could possibly phrase it. And you're also saying that the unicorn market in the venture capital biz, where they didn't have the benefit of a public price for these stocks for many years, they were all venture capitalized. They got to these 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 billion valuations. Now the market finally is saying, hey, wait a minute, it's really 80 or 90% cheaper. Or in the case of WeWork, it looks like they're going to go bust. It looks like this company is going to go to zero. This looks like the Enron of venture capital, Mitch. But, you know, in the first half, we covered your chart about the housing bubbles. The top two cities in terms of the jump since 2009 in the length of time required to afford a home are Hong Kong and Paris. Both of these cities are now mired in unrest. The Gilets jaunes in Paris, obviously, and in Hong Kong, we're seeing these enormous street protests. Is this, are these two things connected? Is this a Cantillon effect on display, Mitch?
Absolutely, Max. But here's the problem. Gilets jaunes in France, do you see it anywhere mentioned in the media? The fake news media, it is fake news. They don't cover the real important stories. You can go back to the beginning, going to the housing bubble. It is an example of central banks gone wrong. These are the world's largest hedge funds speculating in markets, and what they've done are inflated the most grotesque asset bubbles in the history of this planet, which will cause the next credit crisis, which will be a crisis of liquidity. Now, going back to the correlation between house prices and income, since the beginning of time, there has always been a correlation between house prices and income. If you take incomes and you look at them from 1981 and you inflation adjust, they're flat to negative to up small, whereas house prices have skyrocketed exponentially. It's an example of a bubble. So in a lot of these cities, this has created jobs because of the ancillary construction services and everything around that, surrounding that. The problem is the prices have skyrocketed. So you walk down main streets, which are decimated in the high streets in England, and the rent has gone up so much that the mom and pop stores are all gone. So, you know, they say it's Amazon. It's not Amazon. It's that the prices have gone up so much that it's not cost effective to open a business anymore. You go bankrupt because you spend too much on your rent. So the correlation has blown out. So something has to happen. Nobody has the money because all the good paying jobs don't exist anymore to buy these £3 million 2-bed flats where you have massive oversupply. So what's going to happen with that? You have protests in Hong Kong and protests in Paris because the most of the population can't afford to live anymore, and they're getting priced out of everything, so they're protesting. And what do they do in France with that? Macron has outlawed protests now. So you don't see it on TV anywhere, you don't hear about it. Those people will be quietly suppressed until they can't be anymore. I think, you know, you see to a larger extent the same thing happening in the UK with Brexit. Over 1,194 days ago, the people, 52% of the people gave a mandate to Parliament to leave the EU, and they still haven't left because Parliament doesn't want to leave.
Right, exactly. Well, you know, I predicted it would never happen for the simple fact that they don't have a constitution. So without a constitution, there's no way you could figure anything as complicated as that out. Now, let me ask you this about Mark Carney, the Bank of England. He recently warned from Jackson Hole, of all places, that the U.S. dollar is toast, that it no longer works as a global reserve currency. This is interesting because he's a central banker, and it seems like he's breaking ranks with the other central bankers by calling out the U.S. dollar. We've got some internecine warfare in the central bank class. Mitch, what's going on here?
Look, we've been speaking about U.S. dollar hegemony for quite a while. The U.S. dollar has been the reserve currency for a little over 100 years. Before that, sterling was the reserve currency for around 300 years. Right now, the amount of debt that America has, it's $260 trillion. So eventually people are going to say, well, what's currency? Currency is a promise by a government to repay their debt. Fiat currency is backed by nothing except the military. The U.S. does have the biggest military, but can they repay their debt? Absolutely not. So when you reach a point like the UK has and the US has and certain other countries have, where your debt service becomes much higher than your revenues, that's when they bring in negative interest rates because you realize that otherwise you will default on your debt. So will a default happen? Look, they've got steal from savers with this negative yielding bond scenario around the world. That's just stealing from savers to fund bailouts and fund profligacy around. Italy has $4 trillion in debt they can never repay, and they won't. They said that they won't, but people are laughing it off like they will. So this is the problem that needs to be resolved. It just won't go on. It goes on until it can't anymore, and I think we're at the point where it can't anymore.
To be clear, when you mentioned the U.S. has $260 trillion in debt, they've got about 20 or 22 trillion officially in debt, and when you add in the unfunded liabilities like Social Security and Medicaid, et cetera, Medicare, it all adds up to 260 trillion. And that's on an economy, the economic base of 17 trillion, so that's unsustainable. And so that's why you see interest rates going negative, is because we're in a deflationary death spiral of doom heading to absolute debt apocalypse. Mitch, we're going to have to carry you over to a second segment because you're just so darn interesting. Thank you.
Great. Can't wait, Max.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Mitch Feierstein of PlanetPonzi.com. You can catch us on Twitter at Keiser Report or KeiserReport.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.